motions, in my mind, was always exhilarating. It was delightful to observe the nimbleness with which they pieced broken ends, as the mule carriage began to recede from the fixed roller beam, and to see them at leisure, after a few seconds' exercise of their tiny fingers, to amuse themselves in any attitude they chose, till the stretch and winding on were once more completed. The work of these lively elves seemed to resemble a sport, in which habit gave them a pleasing dexterity. Conscious of their skill, they were delighted to show it off to any stranger. As to exhaustion by the day's work, they evinced no trace of it on emerging from the mill in the evening, for they immediately began to skip about any neighboring playground, and to commence their little games with the same alacrity as boys issuing from a school. Naturally, as though the immediate movement of every muscle were not an urgent necessity for frames grown at once stiff and relaxed. But you should have waited to see whether this momentary excitement had not subsided after a couple of minutes. And besides, you could see this whole performance only in the afternoon after 5 or 6 hours' work, but not in the evening. As to the health of the operatives, the bourgeois has the boundless impudence to cite the report of 1833 just quoted in 1,000 places, as testimony for the excellent health of these people, to try to prove, by detached and garbled quotations, that no trace of scrofula can be found among them, and, what is quite true, that the factory system frees them from all acute diseases. That they have every variety of chronic affection instead he naturally conceals. To explain the impudence with which our Ferengior palms off the grossest falsehoods upon the English public, it must be known that the report consists of 3 large folio volumes, which it never occurs to a Welsh English bourgeois to study through. Let us hear further how he expresses himself as to the Factory Act of 1834, passed by the liberal bourgeoisie, and imposing only the most meagre limitations upon the manufacturers, as we shall see. This law, especially its compulsory education clause, he calls an absurd and despotic measure directed against the manufacturers, through which all children under 12 years of age have been thrown out of employment, and with what results? The children thus discharged from their light and useful occupation receive no education whatsoever. Cast out from the warm spinning room into a cold world, they subsist only by begging and stealing, a life in sad contrast with their steadily improving condition in the factory and in Sunday school. Under the mask of philanthropy, this law intensifies the sufferings of the poor, and will greatly restrict the conscientious manufacturer in his useful work, if, indeed, it does not wholly stop him. 169. The ruinous influence of the factory system began at an early day to attract general attention. We have already alluded to the Apprentices Act of 1802. Later, towards 1817, Robert Owen, then a manufacturer in New Lanark, in Scotland, afterwards founder of English socialism, began to call the attention of the government, by memorials and petitions, to the necessity of legislative guarantees for the health of the operatives, and especially of children. The late Sir Robert Peel and other philanthropists united with him, and gradually secured the Factory Acts of 1818, 1825, and 1831, of which the first 2 were never enforced, and the last only here and there. This law of 1831, based upon the motion of Sir J. C. Hobhouse, provided that in cotton mills no one under 21 should be employed between 7:30 at night and 5:30 in the morning, and that in all factories young persons under 18 should work no longer than 12 hours daily, and 9 hours on Saturday. But since operatives could not testify against their masters without being discharged, this law helped matters very little. In the great cities, where the operatives were more restive, the larger manufacturers came to an agreement among themselves to obey the law, but even there were many who, like the employers in the country, did not trouble themselves about it. Meanwhile, the demand for a 10-hours law had become lively among the operatives, that is, for a law which should forbid all operatives under 18 years of age to work longer than 10 hours daily. The trades unions, by their agitation, made this demand general throughout the manufacturing population. The philanthropic section of the Tory party, then led by Michael Sadler, seized upon the plan, and brought it before Parliament. Sadler obtained a parliamentary committee for the investigation of the factory system, and this committee reported in 1832. Its report was emphatically partisan, composed by strong enemies of the factory system, for party ends. Sadler permitted himself to be betrayed by his noble enthusiasm into the most distorted and erroneous statements, drew from his witnesses by the very form of his questions, answers which contained the truth, but truth in a perverted form. The manufacturers themselves, incensed at a report which represented them as monsters, now demanded an official investigation. They knew that an exact report must, in this case, be advantageous to them. They knew that Whigs, genuine bourgeois, were at the helm, with whom they were upon good terms, whose principles were opposed to any restriction upon manufacture. They obtained a commission, in due order, composed of liberal bourgeois, whose report I have so often cited. This comes somewhat nearer the truth than Sadler's, but its deviations therefrom are in the opposite direction. On every page it betrays sympathy with the manufacturers, distrust of the Sadler report, repugnance to the working men agitating independently, and the supporters of the 10 Hours Bill. It nowhere recognizes the right of the working man to a life worthy of a human being, to independent activity, and opinions of his own. It reproaches the operatives that, in sustaining the 10 Hours Bill they thought, not of the children only, but of themselves as well. It calls the working men engaged in the agitation demagogues, ill-intentioned, malicious, etc., is written, in short, on the side of the bourgeoisie. And still it cannot whitewash the manufacturers, and still it leaves such a mass of infamies upon the shoulders of the employers, that even after this report, the agitation for the 10 Hours Bill, the hatred against the manufacturers, and the committee's severest epithets applied to them are all fully justified. But there was the one difference, that whereas the Sadler report accuses the manufacturers of open, undisguised brutality, it now became evident that this brutality was chiefly carried on under the mask of civilization and humanity. Yet Dr. Hawkins, the medical commissioner for Lancashire, expresses himself decidedly in favour of the 10 Hours Bill in the opening lines of his report, and Commissioner Mackintosh explains that his own report does not contain the whole truth, because it is very difficult to induce the operatives to testify against their employers, and because the manufacturers, besides being forced into greater concessions towards their operatives by the excitement among the latter, are often prepared for the inspection of the factories, have them swept, the speed of the machinery reduced, etc. In Lancashire especially they resorted to the device of bringing the overlookers of workrooms before the commissioners, and letting them testify as working men to the humanity of the employers, the wholesome effects of the work, and the indifference, if not the hostility of the operatives, towards the 10 Hours Bill. But these are not genuine working men, they deserters from their class, who have entered the service of the bourgeoisie for better pay, and fight in the interests of the capitalists against the workers. Their interest is that of the capitalists, and they are, therefore, almost more hated by the workers than the manufacturers themselves. And yet this report suffices wholly to exhibit the most shameful recklessness of the manufacturing bourgeoisie towards its employees, the whole infamy of the industrial exploiting system in its full inhumanity. Nothing is more revolting than to compare the long register of diseases and deformities engendered by overwork, in this report, with the cold, calculating political economy of the manufacturers, by which they try to prove that they, and with them all England, must go to ruin, if they should be forbidden to cripple so and so many children every year. The language of Dr. Ure alone, which I have quoted, would be yet more revolting, if it were not so preposterous. The result of this report was the Factory Act of 1834, which forbade the employment of children under 9 years of age, except in silk mills, limited the working hours of children between 9 to 13 years to 48 per week, or 9 hours in any one day at the utmost, that of young persons from 14 to 18 years of age to 69 per week, or 12 on any one day as the maximum, provided for an hour and a half as the minimum interval for meals, and repeated the total prohibition of night work for persons under 18 years of age. Compulsory school attendance 2 hours daily was prescribed for all children under 14 years, and the manufacturer declared punishable in case of employing children without a certificate of age from the factory surgeon, and a certificate of school attendance from the teacher. As recompense, the employer was permitted to withdraw 1 penny from the child's weekly earnings to pay the teacher. Further, surgeons and inspectors were appointed to visit the factories at all times, take testimony of operatives on oath, and enforce the law by prosecution before a justice of the peace. This is the law against which Dr. Ure inveighs in such unmeasured terms. The consequence of this law, and especially of the appointment of inspectors, was the reduction of working hours to an average of 12 to 13, and the superseding of children as far as possible. Hereupon some of the most crying evils disappeared almost wholly. Deformities arose now only in cases of weak constitution, and the effects of overwork became much less conspicuous. Nevertheless, enough testimony remains to be found in the factory report, that the lesser evils,